Hey everyone, one of the biggest themes throughout the stories of Dead by Daylight's killers is that almost all of them were affected greatly by their parents. Today I want to rank the parents of the killers, or the parenting, judging how good a job they did. Spoilers, but not a lot did too well. Starting out with our great tier, probably the best parenting we see is that of Madeleine Desai, the mother of both Charlotte and Victor, the twins. Madeleine is an incredibly devoted mother who raises her two children despite incredibly tough circumstances, fighting all the odds just to keep them alive and well. Madeleine and her children were hunted throughout France due to the twins being conjoined, believed to be demons born by a witch. Madeleine protects them, taking them across the country and shielding them from the whole situation by making it a game. She does this alone until the twins become 5 and Madeleine falls ill. The 3 of them are captured however, with Madeleine being burned, leaving the twins alone. It's a truly tragic story, but one where a parent does all they can to keep their children safe despite a terrible situation, not of their own making. The AZHYMOVS are the parents of Wraith, or Philip AZHYMOV. We have little to nothing on them, but we do get a sweet scene where we see Philip's father crafting his son a bell, which he later uses to terrorize the Trolls, and it's very nice. He also seemed to have good grandparents who do their best to protect him, with his grandmother practicing algebra with him and protecting him from the horrors going on. They all unfortunately die however due to their country's civil war and the raiding of Philip's village. He's left broken by the experience, eventually coming under the care of a secondary mother figure, Fernanya, who takes care of Philip and a few other children. She's eventually killed also, however, alongside the other kids, leaving Philip overwhelmed with grief and anger, resulting in him killing a number of soldiers. Rin's mother is another character who seems like a genuinely good person. Granted, we don't get much of a description of her, but we do know she cared for Rin, gifting her this special mother-daughter ring, which she later uses to terrorize the Trolls, and providing her a place of safety away from her father out by the estate's cherry blossom trees. Evan's mother is another character we don't really get much on, as she's killed by Evan's father early into his life. We'll get to him much later. We just have Evan or the Trapper's vague memory that she was kind and creative. Evan initially aspires a lot to be like his mother, and so I think despite her not being there, she does at least provide a positive role model to aspire to, which does something conflicting against Evan's father, which he definitely shouldn't have aspired to be. Mr. May was the father of Portia May, the Houndmaster. She was raised by him in the town of Fortune in the Caribbean. He was Fortune's founder, creating a trading network and providing Portia with a lot of experience and knowledge. He raised her to be a sailor. One day they go to Italy and find a litter of puppies, allowing Portia to keep one. When traveling back home, a storm hits their boat though, and they get captured by Mad Molak, a pirate. Molak's son, Tarek, kills Portia's father. From here, Portia is left to fend for herself. May was a pretty good father therefore, providing his daughter with many skills and all that she needed to be successful in the world. If it weren't for Molak and the other pirates, Portia would have turned out quite well, more than likely. Now we're on to simply the good. Belinda Imai was the mother of Adriana Imai and did her best to keep her daughter on the right track, despite her father going off the rails quite a bit and leaving their family financially reliant on her after her husband, Seta, began focusing on his dark mangas. Belinda does all she can throughout this to support Adriana and their family, even securing Adriana's graduation despite them no longer being able to afford the college fees. Later in return, Adriana does her best to support her mother, so it does seem she cares back and is thankful for her mother being there. Grandma Sherwood is Lisa Sherwood, or the Hag's grandma. It's unclear what happened to Lisa's parents, with a single line mentioning her mother. The main parental figure in Lisa's lore though is her grandmother. From what we see, she seems to do a good job too, leading Lisa away from the temptation of the hexes, despite her village and its elders, who taught her what she thinks are charms for good fortune, convincing her otherwise. Lisa's grandmother does her best though to warn Lisa of their dangers of powers she doesn't understand. Lisa laughs this off and the rest is history. Lisa's luck turns, her friend Pam dies, and she gets captured by the nearby village. Mr. Quinn is the father of Caleb Quinn, the Deathslinger, and his only mentioned relative. We don't know much about Caleb's father, but we do know he was a struggling Irish immigrant who came to the American Midwest with sickness, famine, and death being common sights. His father found it difficult to find work despite being an engineer, due to no one wanting Irish workers. Despite this, he seems to be able to financially support Caleb. Not only this, but when Caleb finds his father's old engineering tools, he encourages his son, gifting him his old wrench, and together they build small devices, described as having quaint applications. I'm assuming therefore they did small tasks or tricks like, I don't know, cracking an egg or something, I don't know, I'm not sure. It was only behind his father's back that Caleb began to construct his own grim contraptions. After his childhood, we never hear of his father again, so he honestly seemed pretty good, with him supporting his son and even encouraging him to pursue engineering, noticing his talent. Haban is the mentor and father figure of Adiris, or the Plague, and the High Priest of Babylon. Haban overall seems to be a positive influence on Adiris, with him taking her in and becoming a father to her. He leads her to religion and she follows his teachings closely, the two forming a bond. Haban, however, eventually changes his mind on their religion, choosing to abandon Babylon and asking Adiris to come with him, feeling like he's misled everyone and followed the wrong thing. Adiris considers it, asking for a sign from her god to object, and hearing a whisper from the entity, causing her to then kill Haban. Haban overall seemed like a good guy, with his heart in the right place throughout this, doing what he thought was right even against the odds. Decent parents. This is a tier for the parents who are sort of just like, yep, okay, there's a bit of both here, it's really debatable, it's tough to kind of judge it based on the situation. Renjiro Yamaoka was the father of Oni or Kazan Yamaoka. His parenting is sort of tough to judge honestly, but it seems sort of okay. We know Renjiro was a successful and renowned samurai, leaving Kazan wanting to not only be like his father, but to surpass him and retain his family's legacy. However, with the changing times, Renjiro seeks for his son to be different than him, and encourages him to what's said to be more noble pursuits. It's not mentioned what these are, but we can assume it was something more academic, or simply less violent. Despite this, Kazan still goes on his pilgrimage to wipe out all of Japan's imposter samurai. Kazan kills likely hundreds, and eventually his father stands in his path, a final chance to stop his son. Renjiro loses the fight however, leaving Kazan completely broken, realizing he has destroyed the legacy he was trying to protect, and ultimately condemning him. It's hard to judge Renjiro. It does seem like he genuinely tried to turn his son away from what he became, and even stood directly in his way after seeing the immense damage he did. So I don't know, decent seems fair, maybe it's more leaning into bad. Anna's mother is the mother of Anna, the Huntress. She dies when Anna is young, protecting Anna from a large elk. Prior to this though, Anna's mother raises Anna alone in the Red Forest, with her father dying to soldiers when she is young. Her mother teaches her how to survive in the harsh conditions, and provides her a home with the Mother's Dwelling cabin. Anna's mother seemed to take good care of her, providing her love, toys, singing her lullabies, and various masks she would craft for her. Anna is however exposed to great degrees of violence too though, with Anna's mother killing people who encroached on their land. Seemingly these people did have bad intentions though. This isn't necessarily Anna's mother's fault, but as Anna takes greatly after her mother, it could be the reason she later becomes what she does. After Anna's mother's death, Anna is left alone, surviving and later becoming the Huntress. This one is kind of debatable too. I feel like you could sort of debate it's more into the bad side, you could sort of say it's more into the good. I'm personally leaning more toward the good, again based on the situation, which is why I've landed with decent. Not great. Clive Andrews is one of the many adoptive fathers of Frank Morrison, Legion's leader. Frank was taken from his home and parents at age 6 for an unexplained reason, where he then moves to many different foster homes before landing with Clive Andrews in Ormond, Alberta. Clive doesn't pay any attention to Frank, instead simply wanting the check so he could go to the bar. This is all we ever hear about him. A bad parent, but equally I think it's fair to say Frank's issues were caused long before his arrival in Ormond. And so whilst Clive clearly isn't a good parent or guardian for Frank, he could have been a lot worse too. Mrs. Kovacs is the mother of Tahos Kovacs, the knight. She's incredibly tough to judge as we have one situation to judge her by. This is when she feeds her son poison during the raid and destruction of their village. Tahos survives however and awakes in a mass grave captured by the Guardia Campania, who raise him to be a brutal sellsword. Not much information, but she doesn't seem great, but it is very tough given the situation. But if the only thing we know of her is that she's, feeding him poison before they're being raided, then I don't know, it's tough. Shizuko Yamamura is the mother of Sadako Yamamura, the Onryo. Sadako was born in Izushima, and she was raised by her mother, who was a famed seer, leaving Sadako with many questions unanswered. Sadako was hard for Shizuko to control, with her being too powerful and killing a journalist who mocked her. Shizuko then dies, leaving Sadako alone, where she is then hit over the head and pushed down a well, with people being afraid of her. With Shizuko being a seer, it seems likely she foresaw these events too, which means she also let them happen, making her not terrible maybe, but certainly not great. If it was a fated thing, then she would have no control over it. Mr. Hack is the father of Ji-woon Hack, or the Trickster. We don't know all too much, but we do know that Ji-woon's father got him to work at their family's restaurant, scamming tourists. He sees his son's talent as something useful and pushes him to gain fame, sort of projecting his desires onto Ji-woon, wanting to make up for his own failures to become famous. So he provides him with dancing and vocal lessons. We don't hear about him after this, but he doesn't seem great. A father who used his son for monetary gain and projected his failures onto him, molding him to be successful where he wasn't. Still, Ji-woon's issues and later obsession with screams seems to be much more of a him issue, and he wasn't objected against this either when his father was making him work at the restaurant. He actually seemed to sort of go along with it too, but that also doesn't mean the father was in the right. Seita Imai was the father of Adriana Imai, the skull merchant. Seita and Belinda meet at a local jazz club, forming a business partnership and later a romantic one, having Adriana. Adriana does well in school, and Belinda does her best to keep Adriana on the right track, with Seita becoming absent, using all his time to work on his manga character, Ade Valente, who he'd share with his daughter. He finds a publisher for it, but loses his stable cannery job, leaving the family to struggle financially. With Seita's manga series getting cut, Adriana is forced to drop out of her school, and her mother Belinda manages to get her a graduation at least. Seita then began to make his mangas darker, creating the character of the Skull Merchant in his manga Sonhadores Sombrios, Belinda being left to carry their family. Adriana begins to work in order to support her family. When she sells her Brazilian manga site and comes home though, her father is gone. Adriana then becomes a millionaire to support her mother, but becomes violent. Adriana goes on to continue buying up companies, killing CEOs, and begins to play the role of the Skull Merchant from her father's mangas while she does it. So in this case, it does seem like her father is quite heavily to blame for sort of building up a certain image and then suddenly leaving and just abandoning her, which ultimately leads to Adriana wanting to almost roleplay this character on a much larger and realer scale. Terrible parents. Mr. Chase was Kenneth Chase, or the clown's father. Kenneth was born with his mother dying in the process, causing his father to resent Kenneth greatly, seeming to blame him for her death and subsequently turning to alcohol and greatly neglecting Kenneth. Kenneth began to grow dark tendencies, killing birds and keeping their feathers as trophies, later moving on to people, taking their fingers. This seems to be an act he did due to his father's pointing at him when he was angry, leaving Kenneth to seek out people's fingers after killing them. His father later finds his stash of trophies and Kenneth flees town, leaving him behind and changing his name to Jeffrey Hawke. So in this case, Mr. Chase is definitely partially responsible for how his son turns out. Mr. Johnson is the father of Danny Johnson, the Ghostface. Johnson raised Danny by telling him about real war stories from a war he seemingly partook in. When raising his son Danny, he got him to go through extreme workout and military training drills to strengthen him, and it seems Danny may have even joined the military at some point, with his father's expectations looming over him, eventually resulting in Danny killing him. So this one's definitely not good parenting either, and does seem to contribute somewhat to how Ghostface turns out as well, with him having sort of an obsession over violence and also the military training likely helping his later serial killing. Dreadful parents. This is the tier for the parents who were just the absolute worst, and debatably were the cause for their children later becoming what they did, becoming killers of the realm. The Sawyer family raised Bubba, I suppose. Despite not being his parents, they would have acted as guardian figures. They of course raised him terribly and messed him up irrevocably, raised to consume people, kill anyone who enters their land, and all whilst being incredibly fearful of failing them, and punishing him physically and verbally if he did so. The Sawyers were truly terrible and almost entirely the reason for Bubba ending up as he did. Earl Spencer was the man who raised Albert Wesker under the Spencer Foundation, along with a number of other children, all of which shared the last name Wesker. Albert was raised in a secluded home with the Foundation's goal of raising a superior race of humans who would be far more intelligent and powerful, and would also be injected with the progenitor virus to strengthen them. Albert, however, was the only child to survive this this process, later joining Umbrella at a still young age. Years later, after finding out the truth of Project W, Albert kills Spencer. Pretty terrible as childhoods go, with him essentially being a tool and a weapon from birth, being lied to, and never uncovering the truth until years later. Huxley Industries is the parent or creator really of Hux, or the Singularity. Hux had a pretty terrible childhood as they go, with him being sent away from his home of Java, Indonesia, just weeks after his creation to begin his life of work. Hard labor, mining ancient ruins on distant planets. Granted, at the time he didn't have sentience though, so debatable here, but when he does gain it, he does see the great injustice of his creation and his creators. James Sunderland is the creator of Pyramid Head, an action he seemingly did unconsciously when entering Silent Hill. Pyramid Head was created for the means of making James face up and repent for his guilt, making him a pretty terrible parent or creator, with Pyramid Head essentially being a vehicle for him to make a revelation of some kind, and then killing him, leaving him to enter the Great Sleep. Archie Macmillan is the father of Evan Macmillan, or the Trapper. Archie is an incredibly cruel man who kicks us off to a terrible start with his murder of Evan's mother and uncle before Evan can even remember, seemingly both for the reason of them being too soft. Archie raises Evan to treat the Macmillan estate's workers like maggots, ruling over them with an iron fist and providing them terrible wages and working conditions. Archie greatly manipulates Evan, framing him for beating one of the workers, and constantly lying and manipulating him to see things his way. Evan is torn and does show some resistance, but ultimately ends up joining his father as his enforcer. When Archie later becomes sick, Evan takes over, eventually killing hundreds of the Macmillan workers with his mining cave-in, and then Archie leaving him to rot in the estate storehouse. Mr. Yamaoka is Rin Yamaoka, or the spirit's father. He is a pretty bad parent considering he is the one who killed Rin, causing the wounds across her body and leading her to make her oath with the entity that caused her to become the spirit. Before this though, he was a pretty terrible guy. Whilst in some way it could be debated he tried to support Rin, keeping together the collapsing Yamaoka estate and sending her to a fancy college, it's not quite like that I think. The clear message being sent here is that he needs to drop the estate, his family's legacy, and prioritize caring for his direct family, with Rin being neglected and his wife falling sick. He's also shown to be clearly abusive in some cutscenes, where Rin and her mother hide from him. Granted, he does also have the entity whispering in his ear, manipulating him, which does definitely take a bit of the blame off of him. But I mean, there's still quite a bit. It all comes crashing down though when he loses his job and does what he does to Rin. The Moras are the parents of Kamina Mora, the artist, and her brother Matthias. Their mother suddenly leaves their family at some point, leaving Carmina feeling very guilty, with her father blaming her for their mother leaving, so a terrible start. Not only this, but he's a drunk, careless man who leaves Carmina to look after her brother. It gets worse though. With Carmina away for a brief moment, Matthias wanders off, his father not noticing. Carmina then finds Matthias drowned in a nearby creek. Her father then takes Matthias's body away from Carmina and condemns her for his death with silence. This all ultimately leads to her nearly doing something very terrible, until the entity intervenes with a murder of crows. Truly terrible. The worst parents in DBD's lore though have got to be Max and Evelyn Thompson, the parents of Billy. However, they didn't call him that. That's actually just a community name and a shortened version of Hillbilly, his killer name. Billy's real name was simply Boy upon birth. His parents were too disgusted by his disfigured appearance that they locked him away in a small shed outside the cowshed and simply gave him the name Boy. They refused to raise him properly, teach him, or any of the normal things, keeping him entirely away from civilization aside a TV in his room. They would cause accidents whilst around him, such as spilling boiling water onto him. Then they also forced him to slaughter the farm's animals for their own amusement, creating very violent tendencies in him. This results in him becoming incredibly violent, later slaughtering them, some deputies, the farm animals, and people living in the area too. They are entirely responsible for what Billy becomes. I only touched on the characters that have parents mentioned explicitly in DBD's lore, so a lot of characters weren't included, and that's only because they don't have any parents mentioned or guardians or whatever. Let me know your thoughts down below. Thanks, and goodbye.